Well, welcome everybody who can be with us tonight. My name is Josh Rosa. I'm a volunteer with Better Ballot Sacramento, and I'm joined tonight by Ismar Volic, the author of Making Democracy Count, and with Deb Otis, who is the Director of Research for Fair Vote. And we're going to have a panel today to talk about ranked choice voting for Sacramento. There's a lot of panels about RCV. We're going to talk about RCV for Sacramento. And this event is organized by Better Ballot Sacramento. We're a coalition of community organizations that are all collectively supporting ranked choice voting for Sacramento's city council local elections. Folks are encouraged to check us out at betterballotsacramento.org or on social media, Instagram, Blue Sky, and Facebook. We're going to cover three topics today with three presentations. First, Professor Volic is going to give a presentation on ranked choice voting explained for folks who don't know how RCV works, even for folks who do know how it works. This will be a good presentation that compares RCV to other popular election methods. Then our next presenter, Deb, is going to present RCV in practice. What have been the outcomes of RCV, where it is being used in the United States? And then finally and thirdly, I'm going to give a presentation on how RCV could benefit Sacramento specifically, given the issues with Sacramento's current election process. And we really encourage folks to ask questions. Let's make this an interactive event. We're going to go through these three brief presentations, but as we're going through them, attendees are encouraged to ask questions in the chat, and then we'll get to those questions, and our panelists can help with these questions after those three presentations. Okay, so without further ado, I'm going to introduce our first presenter, Ismar Volic, Professor of Mathematics at Wellesley College, to give his presentation.
Great, thank you so much, Josh. And there is the window where I get to share my slides. And hopefully everybody's seeing this. Don't be alarmed by the number 62 up top. That just each slide consists of many sub-slides, so it's not 62 slides. But let me just briefly say, first of all, thank you for having me. It really is an honor to have been invited to this event. You might be wondering, sort of, what's a mathematician doing here? But it turns out many of our democratic processes are really just fundamentally mathematical, right? The way you gather votes and you tally them, which is what we're talking about today. But even beyond that, the way you apportion House of Representatives, the way you district and gerrymander, the way you quantify power, the way you quantify whether we are being represented somehow in a good way, whether the will of the people is being heard. Those are things that you can actually attach mathematical meaning to. And when you do that, there's an advantage to this. You are speaking now in a universal objective language that is a common to everyone, right? Especially valuable in this polarized moment. And it's not political. It's not emotional. It doesn't cling to tradition or history. It starts from this objective universal place of mathematics. So that's where I want to speak from today. And I've been tasked with just quickly explaining what RCV is and how it compares to things that you have you know something about. So let me see. How do I click through this? Maybe down. No, I have to make this window active probably. There it is. Okay. Now we're happening. Okay, so what we do in most U.S. elections, in fact, the next thing we'll say is that there are about 520,000 elected offices in the U.S. and all but a handful of them are elected using what's called a plurality voting or relative majority or first past the post, or winner take all. It has so many names because we use it so much, and the world uses it so much. There are issues with this that stem from a basic fact, which is that if you have 3 candidates or more in a plurality election, the winner, the person with the most votes, doesn't have to be the majority winner necessarily. So we're all familiar with this voting system, right? You go into the booth and you circle one name, and the person with the most circles, the most votes wins, right? So that's what plurality voting is. But as soon as you have, again, more than 3 candidates, you could have someone with winning with 40, 30, even 20% of the votes, depending on how many candidates are running. So that's a simple observation. I hope that makes sense. So it's relative majority or plurality versus absolute majority, and one does not imply the other in a race with 3 or more candidates. This creates all kinds of issues, right? And the two that I want to touch upon, and I'm sure you've heard of them, are the most common ones: vote splitting and spoiler effect. They can both, again, be analyzed and thought about mathematically. There are a slew of other issues with plurality voting that I'll briefly try to say something about later, but these are the two most salient ones. And let me just give you some examples of these. So vote splitting is when similar candidates, similar in relation to some other candidates who may be more fringe or extreme, uh, split the votes so as to allow this more extreme candidates to bubble up to the top and take over the win. Whereas spoiler effect is kind of a similar thing, but it typically, the way we heuristically think about this is there is a candidate who can win. Typically, this is a weaker candidate, but they take away enough votes from a major candidate so as to allow a different major candidate to win. Okay, so let me just illustrate with some examples. 2016 Republican primaries. I'm sure you all remember this. It had, Republican primaries had a lot of candidates. So the more candidates you have, the more chance there is that some of these anomalies like vote splitting and spoiler effect will happen. Trump, of course, was considered a fringe candidate at that point, but as we know, he won the Republican nomination. Now, he won that with fewer than 50% of the vote. And I could spend hours telling you about the horrible math of primary elections and how each state does their own thing. And, it does not in any way achieve any of the stated goals of primaries, such as proportional representation, et cetera. But that's a different topic. The point here is that Trump was ahead and won the nomination with 44.9% of the vote. But according to exit polling and polling in general, we know that most Republican voters would have actually preferred any of these 3 other major candidates, Rubio, Kasich, or Cruz, to be the Republican nominee. So if those more than 50% of Republican candidates who voted for not Trump had a chance somehow through the system, systemically express this opinion that they really would have rather had any of these candidates than Trump. If the voting system allowed them to do this, the outcome would not have been that. This way, we have someone who was elected with fewer than 50% of the votes, representing 100% of the population, Republican voters in this sense. So this is vote splitting. Cruz, Rubio, and Kasich, who were fairly, similar compared to Trump at the moment, had kind of split the vote, allowing Trump to win. I'll give you one more example that's relevant to me. I'm sitting in a district in Massachusetts that is represented by Jake Auchincloss, a Democrat. And in 2020, in the Democratic primary race, which is really the real race here, as I imagine it is in much of California, right? I could also spend hours talking about non-competitiveness of most races in the in the U.S. That is also enabled by the mathematically flawed system with systems with which you run districting and voting and gerrymandering and all that stuff. Also a topic for another time. But Jake Auchincloss won the primaries with 22% of the vote. So these 3 other women that you see on the screen are all fantastic progressive women who just split the vote. They're similar enough in their platforms that people kind of voted for each of them at the same rate, allowing Jay Auchincloss to win with 22%. Interestingly, all of these candidates support ranked choice voting. After Jay Auchincloss was elected, he, as typically happens, he fell kind of silent on the on the topic of support for RCV. Then he went and handily won in the general election against the Republican counterpart. Jay Auchincloss got reelected in 2020 in an uncontested race. This is what typically happens with incumbents. He's probably going to be sitting in Congress for the next 30 years, having the support of 22% of the people, representing 100% of the people in District 4, Massachusetts, where I'm sitting right now. So that's a classic vote splitting situation. One of the canonical, like the example that we always talk about with the spoiler effect, namely a smaller candidate causing some kind of an anomalous win to happen, is the 2020 presidential elections. Those of you who are old enough, I'm sure, remember this, where Ralph Nader, I'll just show you this entire slide. You can look at it. So it all came down to Florida, where whoever won the electoral votes from Florida was going to become the president. So Ralph Nader was from the Green Party, won about 100,000 votes. The marginal win was 537 votes that Bush had won by, and he became president eventually, and all the Supreme Court got involved, and we all learned things like hanging Chad and dimple Chad, all these words right from 25 years ago. But the point is that most Nader voters, had they been given a chance to express their opinion on a deeper level than just the first candidate, they would have said, we would like Gore to be the president. If Nader can't be the president, then we would prefer Gore. But the system did not account for this. There was no mechanism to take in this opinion of these voters. In other words, most people actually wanted Gore to be the president, but that didn't happen because of plurality voting. Last year there was a few months when we talked about RFK Jr. playing the role of the spoiler. We didn't even know who he might be the spoiler for, and that's even besides the point. The thing that was upsetting to me in this moment when we talked about RFK Jr. was that we just talked about this as if it was a feature of the system. Like, somebody can be a spoiler, and we're going to end up with a candidate or a president who's not really the choice of the people. That's just what happens. Okay. Well, this doesn't have to be just what happens. Any system that allows the spoiler effect, that allows the sort of wrong candidate to be selected, should be discarded, should be just thrown in the trash. The fact that we are so cavalier with this is just, to me as a mathematician and as a citizen, is just unfathomable. There is a contingent of people who will say, well, this is why we have runoff elections, right? So typically a runoff means that there's a second election among top two scoring candidates in the first election. And then they go on and compete at a later date, I don't know, 6 weeks later, 2 months later, in what is now a two-candidate election, right? So, for example, in this made-up example, you might have 5 candidates, A, B, C, D, E, and that those are the percentages of votes that they won. Since nobody won a majority, nobody won 50% plus 1 votes, there's a runoff that'll be held at a later date between candidates A and B, because they were the top scorers. So because you have 2 candidates, now that second election will necessarily result in a majority win, right? Because when 2 people are competing, somebody has to win. If somebody wins, that's more than 50% of the vote. So that feels like a good thing to do. You are electing a candidate ultimately who has majority support, so it makes you feel good about that. I would like to argue that, so sometimes it's called plurality with runoff, or 2-round runoff. I think you in Sacramento call it 2-round runoff, if I'm not mistaken. There are several issues with this. To me, the least problem is the logistical one, but that's already a big problem. So you have to have a second election. You're asking people to come out for the second election that costs money to put on. the turnout is typically much lower, right? Everybody's sick of this at that point. So logistically and turnout wise, this is an issue. But the thing I want to impress upon you as a mathematician is having a runoff election does not solve any of the problems that I just talked about. Okay, it's a misconception that it does, and I can illustrate this very easily. I'll give you an example. Again, from my neck of the woods here. So in 2021, we had a mayoral election, and Michelle Wu was ultimately elected mayor of Boston, and she's great. I love her. But what happened in this first round? So we have a nonpartisan, sort of open first round, kind of general primary election for the mayor, and these were the top 5 scorers that you see on the slide. So since again nobody won 50%, Michelle Wu and Anissa Saibi George, who were the top scorers, went on to the general election. Again, 6 weeks later, second election. And at that point, Michelle Wu won with, again, necessarily more than 50%, or what, I forget exactly what the margin of win was. But if you look at these numbers carefully, and if you look at Andrea Campbell and Kim Janey, there might have been vote splitting there, right? Maybe the people who wanted Campbell to win, maybe Janey was their second choice, and vice versa. Maybe all those people, 39% of the voters, would have been happy with either of those candidates advancing to the general. So, or in other words, let's put it this way: had Janey maybe not been in the race, Campbell might have had 38% support, which would have put her on top, not just George, but even Wu. She would have been first in this ranking, which means she would have gone into the runoff election, and who knows how things would have turned out that way. Similarly, if you look at John Barras, those 3.2% of the votes, maybe he was a spoiler for Andrea Campbell, right? Maybe Barras voters, maybe they had Campbell as a second choice. Maybe they would have liked their votes to be counted towards Campbell somehow, if Barras couldn't have won already, right? Because if you add Barras's 3.2% to Campbell's 19.7, that actually puts Campbell above George. That puts her in second place. So maybe Campbell should have gone to the runoff election with Michelle Wu. This is all hypothetical. Actually, not so. Barras really was a spoiler. We know from, again, exit polling that he really was a spoiler for Campbell. But anytime you have this kind of a situation where nobody gets more than 50% of the vote, you might have had at that stage, at that first stage of the election, already vote splitting or spoiler effect, which then simply just propagates into the second round, into the runoff election. So the bad math has already taken place in the first election, and the second election doesn't fix that necessarily. So this is why runoff is not. It's an improvement, but it doesn't solve the problems with plurality. All right, so we have vote splitting, spoiler effect. There are other things like a center squeeze effect, it's called. It actually, plurality discourages centrist candidates from running, or it makes it harder for centrist candidates to win. It favors a two-party system. This is something that's known as Duverger's law in economics and political science. And that's related to the next item here. The plurality actually discourages political participation by a variety of parties and groups, simply because the plurality bar is too hard to cross. Smaller parties and underrepresented groups, they don't have the resources to fight these big campaigns by the big two parties in our case. So they just don't participate. They don't see a path forward. They don't participate in the political process. So two major parties are left. Of course, we are the prime example of that, of Duverger law in action. It encourages negative campaigning because it's a zero-sum game. I don't have time to get into this. Encourages dishonest voting. I don't mean this in a bad way. Just the system. So let me give you an example. In 2020 primaries, I voted strategically or dishonestly. I voted for a person who I thought could beat the other candidate in the general election. I didn't vote for the person I liked most. Because plurality has, I didn't want to waste my vote, right? So I engaged in dishonest voting, right? Because the system kind of made me do that. So why do we use it? I wish I had something smart to say here, but I don't. There are really no good reasons why we use plurality voting still. It's just what we know. We've used it for 250 years. Of course, there is no initiative from the top to change this because the Duverger law, right? Republicans and Democrats like having a two-party system that keeps them in power, right? That's why all the politicians who support RCV then go on to be quiet about it because they're not going to mess with the system that elected them, right? So, so there really is no good reason why we use plurality. But if you don't take anything else away from this presentation, I need to wrap it up. I'm running out of time. Just a couple more minutes. Here's what I want you to take away from this. So the way I see the issue is purely mathematically. Plurality voting just takes the top preference, the one preference from the voter. All right. There are better methods, or ranked choice voting is a method that takes more information from the voter. It takes not just the top choice, but it asks the voter who's your second choice, who's your third choice, who's fourth choice, etc. Simply put, math knows math can do more with more information, right? The tallying method, which is mathematical, can better capture sort of the will of the voters, can better understand the group preference of the voters if you give it more information to work with. If you give it very little information to work with, like just the first choice, then chances are it'll mess up a lot of the time. If I said, so here's an analogy, right? So suppose the Fed, okay, there's a lot of talk about the Fed and interest rates, et cetera. We're all waiting with bated breath every quarter what they're going to do. Let's say the Fed comes out and says, we're going to raise interest rates, and we've based this decision on a single parameter, unemployment, okay? Well, that's not enough information. They will make the wrong choice often because unemployment doesn't paint the whole picture of the economy. Where's the GDP? Where's the consumer price index? Where's the new home sales? Where's the stock market, right? You would want the Fed to take all the information in and run a mathematical model with the information and spit out the result that is well informed, right? That took a lot of parameters into consideration. That's what RCV does. It takes more information in so the math can do more with it and give a better candidate. Better in the sense a candidate is more preferred by more people, majority of the people. So quickly, what does this look like? Here's the actual ballot from Maine that uses ranked choice. They use ranked choice voting. So if you see that first column, I don't know if you see my mouse here, but first column is what you would normally see in plurality election. That's just the first choice. But a ranked choice ballot has also asked you who the second choice is, third, fourth, and fifth. However many candidates there are. Sometimes you limit the number of choices you can. There's variants of this. But the point is you're taking in second, third, fourth choices, etc. And the way it works is basically it says, and thank you, Deb, for these slides. You see the FV here, it's fair vote. So Deb had nice slides to share with me. So quickly, how does it work? Suppose you have a candidate who received the least number of first place votes. That's Darius here. So basically, the system says, okay, Darius can win. Darius just does not have enough support. So we're going to allocate those votes that Darius had to the second candidate on each of those ballots where Darius was first. So you're going to redistribute those 10% of votes to the second place per candidate on those ballots. So this might look something like this. So see how Andy got some votes? Those are inherited from Darius. Berta got some votes. Those are inherited from Darius. So Andy and Berta were in second place on those ballots that had Darius first. And then you ask, well, is there anybody with 50% now? The answer in this chart is no. So you look at a person with the least number of first place votes again. This is an iterative process that happens several times if need be. So you redistribute Carla's votes now to the second place candidate on all those ballots that had Carla first. If you see Darius in second place, you skip over Darius because Darius was already eliminated. So these 20% of votes might redistribute to Andy and Berta in this kind of a way. So suddenly Andy has crossed this threshold of 50% and Andy wins the election. All right. So with this system, all of these things, so the following few bullets are just all the other bullets, but negated, right? So you no longer have vote spoilers and vote splitting. There are no wasted votes. It actually encourages participation by smaller parties, discourages negative campaigning. It's like all these good things happen because math knows what to do better with the input. Okay. And let me just flash this and wrap it up. It's, maybe Deb will say more about this, but this is, as we like to say, the largest growing electoral reform in the country. And I've been involved in this 5 or 6 years, not that long. I mean, Deb has been around for, doing this for decades worldwide. But I just feel like even in my short time being around this reform, that there's great energy around it and fantastic things are happening. And with that, I will hand it off to Deb. Thank you for your attention. I went over time. I apologize. And Josh, I think you have to do the switch. Okay, I'm no longer sharing, right? No, good. All right.
Hi, everyone. Great to be here and be talking with you all. And thanks, Ismar, for passing it over to me. I am thrilled to be here with you. For folks on this call, Ismar is a little modest. He published a book last year that is really excellent. It's called Making Democracy Count. And I really enjoyed reading it. And so if you want more of this math-centered look at how you can improve democracy, it's a really good read. So I will go ahead and jump into my portion here and then hand things back to Josh shortly. My name is Deb. I am joining you from Fair Vote. So we are a national nonprofit that works on ranked choice voting. And my role there is Director of Research and Policy. And that means a big part of my job is analyzing how ranked choice voting is working in practice in the places that already use it. So Ismar helpfully presented all of these benefits to what ranked choice voting can do for elections. I'm going to walk through some of those and talk about what the evidence shows, because it is increasingly used in cities, counties, and states around the country. So we know a lot already. So I have shared my screen here. There we go. Okay, so ranked choice voting in practice. This year, we are celebrating 20 years of RCV use in the United States. San Francisco really kicked off what we think of as like the modern era of American ranked choice voting back in 2004. And they just used it in 2024 to elect a new mayor. So after 20 years, what do we know? What do we not know? This is a list of these benefits of ranked choice voting that we talk about. Ismar shared these as well. The goal of my presentation is to talk through what the evidence says. Which of these are working in practice and where do we still need more research? So luckily, at least for me, because I'm a data nerd and this is my job, with ranked choice voting in 50 cities and counties and 2 states, we have had hundreds of ranked choice elections and tens of millions of ranked ballots cast. So there's a lot of data to look at, and it is very fun for folks like me. So what are we seeing? Fair Vote does our own research, particularly around ballot use and ranked choice outcomes. There's also a large body of academic research, so things that get published in political science journals. And so what I'm going to be presenting today is a mix of research that myself and my colleagues have done and things that have been published elsewhere. So a few topics. What are we seeing in the numbers? We're seeing in places that use ranked choice voting, voters like it. And they use the rankings. So 77% in New York City like it and want to keep it. 94% in Santa Fe. Oh, I left Portland blank. I'm sorry about that. This was a draft version. Strong support in Portland, Oregon as well. They just started using it this year. And 71% of voters tend to use the rankings. Use multiple rankings. That means 30% of people are going in and just ranking one candidate, which of course is just fine. Their ballot still counts for that candidate as long as that candidate remains in the race. We typically see candidates who are known to be front runners, so candidates getting a lot of media attention, maybe who raised a lot of money. voters for those candidates are more likely to rank just one. And I think that's a sign that voters kind of understand how this works. Your vote counts for your top choice unless they get eliminated. And so if you're, in the presidential race, if you were voting for the Democrat or the Republican, you have pretty strong confidence that your candidate's going to make it to the end. If your top choice is a third party or independent, you're more likely to need that backup choice. And so we see that in practice. We see voters doing that, which shows me that they understand how their vote's going to be counted. Voters rank when it matters. What else do we see? We see that ranked choice voting is encouraging sincere voting instead of dishonest voting. Ismar introduced this idea. In practice, we're seeing in Utah, voters who used ranked choice voting said they were more likely to vote for their true favorite by a 30-to-1 margin. And then the two states that use ranked choice voting, Maine and Alaska, are among the states with the highest vote share for independent and third-party candidates. So it is working. It's helping break voters out of this lesser of two evils strategic voting mindset. We're also seeing ranked choice elects winners with broad support. 73% of voters in ranked choice elections have gotten one of their top three choices elected. So one of the people they ranked in their top three slots went on to take office. And I think this is really good for voter engagement. A voter looks up the election results the next morning and they see who wins. They say, oh, well, that wasn't my first choice, but I remember them. I ranked her second. Like, she was someone I researched, and now a voter is kind of connected to that campaign and that administration. And I think that's a really helpful thing for bringing voters and elected officials closer together. What else do we see? I have a few more. Tone of campaigns. This is one that advocates talk about a lot. It's not usually the reason people adopt ranked choice voting, but it's one of these nice side benefits. When you're in really a two-person race, there's a lot of incentive to attack your opponent. You want to energize your base. You got to differentiate yourself. There's a reason campaigns go negative, but it's not good for voters. And so ranked choice voting really turns down the temperature. Less mudslinging, more issues-focused campaigning, because if you attack another candidate, guess who's not going to rank you as their second choice, right? You will become the last choice of that voter's support base. So it helps with coalition building and tone of campaigns. And now there's a lot of evidence on this one. This comes from analysis of media coverage, analysis of candidate debate statements, and exit poll research. We are also seeing improved representation. So this ranked choice voting has improved representation for women and people of color, both on the ballot and winning. And so over the last decade, women have won half of municipal ranked choice races, equal to their population percentage. In non-ranked choice cities, it's more like a third. New York City elected its most diverse city council in history, including a majority women city council when they adopted ranked choice voting for the first time a couple of years ago. And my own research finds that voters of color tend to use more ranking. So they're ranking more candidates on their ballot than white voters. And I think this is one of the mechanisms of improved representation. We're also seeing improved voter engagement. That's a big buzzword for me, because with low turnout elections across the country, voter engagement is really important in terms of getting better policy outcomes. Elected officials do want to hear from their voters, and we need systems that make people feel like they're being represented so they get involved. Voters in ranked choice cities are more likely to be contacted by campaigns. And as I mentioned on a previous bullet, the vast majority of voters get one of their top three choices elected. So we're seeing winners who have really broad support. I have a couple of points where the research is more mixed. From an advocacy point of view, I would love for the answer to be yes to everything. Yes, there's research, and that's correct. But there's a couple areas where we either need more research or where research just hasn't been able to isolate the effect. So unclear impact on voter turnout. There's a recent study that shows ranked choice voting boosted municipal turnout in odd year elections. Great, that's amazing. There's another study that says ranked choice did not impact turnout. turnout is definitely impacted if you consolidate 2 rounds of elections into one, if you're not asking voters to show up twice. But if you're just looking at one general election, that turnout tends to be driven by other factors. This year, it was a presidential year. Turnout was really driven by who was on the ballot at the top of the ticket, not so much what did your city ballot look like on page 4, right? So factors other than the ballot style tend to have a bigger impact on turnout. So I can't promise you that this will make everyone show up and vote. There's also an unclear impact on voter trust. So voters who have used ranked choice voting overwhelmingly report they like it, they prefer it over their previous system, and they trust the outcome. But voters who have not used ranked choice are sometimes skeptical. So this is an area, I think, for folks trying to run campaigns where you really have to listen to what's going on in your community, what are people asking questions about, what are people afraid of, and be ready to take those concerns seriously and really engage with those. Skepticism can happen here when the system seems new and different. So overall, I think there's an unclear impact on whether ranked choice voting is going to make people trust elections more. And at a time when there is record low trust in our elections, I kind of wish there was more research on this that showed it had a bigger impact. But we have what we have. I think other factors are impacting voter trust more than how your ballot looks. So I am almost done here. 1 or 2 more slides. Quickly, a quick case study on Sacramento's mayor's elections. I know Josh is going to talk more about the local efforts in Sacramento. This chart here was your primary election this year. So this was back in March. 2 candidates advanced, but there was a third candidate who was really close. This third candidate, Richard Pan, was behind by only 300 votes out of 100,000. So extremely close, but got locked out of the general election, never got to face the general election voters. Now, in the general election, you get twice as many people showing up, and it tends to be a more diverse audience. And so kind of making these decisions at the primary phase and kind of cutting some candidates out before they really get a chance to talk to all of the voters can be really problematic, I think, for representation and for voter engagement. So this was the 2024 mayor's race in Sacramento. And now this did go to a general election, and these top 2 candidates faced off. Both of the previous 2 mayor's elections in Sacramento never even went to the general. They were decided in March and June with really low unrepresentative turnout. Because that's what happens when you have 2-round elections. You've got the people who are tuned in enough to show up in March making the decision. The people who show up in November for the general election, it's too late. We've already decided on the mayor. So I think Sacramento could have a lot to gain from moving all of the action to November. Instead of having voters vote again between the top 2 candidates, just have people rank all of the candidates in one high-stakes, high-turnout election. Lastly, I will just share a couple of sample ballots just to see how these all work. Ismar showed one of these as well. This was a presidential ballot. This was used in Alaska. This is the one from 2020. So this was a Democratic primary. You'll see some familiar Democrat names on there. The next one I will show, I love this one because this is what ballots look like in the real world, right? There tends to be a lot of stuff on there. If you have ranked choice voting for some city offices, but not all, your ballot card might have to mix. So this is from Portland, Maine, and this shows some single choice elections, like their city council district, I think, did not have enough candidates run, so they didn't need the ranking. But then it also has ranked choice voting for one of the offices that was a more crowded field. And this happens a lot in the real world. Election administrators get a lot of curveballs thrown at them, and they figure out how to make it work. And so this is how ranked choice voting can kind of line up with non-ranked races. And lastly, this is one of my favorite ballots. This is from Salt Lake City. And I just think it's very clean, easy to navigate, nicely done. And so that's what I have for you. Open to any questions at the end, but for now, I will turn it back over to Josh for some more info on local efforts in Sacramento.
All right, great. Deb, thank you so much. That was really helpful. And So, having heard from Ismar and Deb, I'll give the third and final presentation about Sacramento specifically. And please, folks, we've already gotten some questions in the chat, but please fire away more good questions that we can go over, and we'll do Q&A as soon as I do that presentation. Before I dive into it, I do want to also plug, though. Deb already plugged it. I have to plug it too. It's Ismar's book. And the reason I want to plug it, and this isn't a sales pitch, I don't have any financial thing to gain from it. Math was not my friend in high school. And I still found the book to be extremely accessible and a very easy read. So I would just recommend it to anybody. Let me go ahead and pull up my presentation. And we're going to talk about our own great city of Sacramento. So, of course, we just heard from Deb largely about what I think of as the universal benefits of RCV. Communities that start using RCV typically see those benefits occur. And we expect that those same universal benefits would largely occur in Sacramento if SAC adopted RCV. But for this presentation, we want to talk also about the specific defects of Sacramento's current election system and how adopting RCV would address those defects. So, first, to define Sacramento's current election system, it can be, one of the terms that Ismar used is plurality with runoff. That same system is also sometimes called a contingent primary, or it's also sometimes called a two-round runoff. And that's what Sacramento uses for our local elections to city council. And here's how it basically works. So first, the candidates will run in the primary election in the spring. And of course, a candidate wants to get a majority of the vote. But if there's more than two candidates and if they split the vote, then it could be that no candidate gets a majority of the vote. And if that happens, then the top two vote getters will have to run all over again in the general election in the fall. That's what we call the runoff. And of course, in the fall election, the candidate that gets the most votes will win. So that's the two-round runoff. Might sound like a good idea, but we've had some problems with the way it turns out. Sacramento's current method creates a lose-lose situation for representativeness. So either a candidate will win in the primary by getting a majority of the vote, but that's concerning because primary elections get very low voter turnout, or two candidates who go to a runoff have to run all over again in the fall, and campaigns can be very expensive. So it really increases the fundraising burden placed on candidates. So RCV can solve these problems and create benefits. So first, RCV could increase voter participation in council elections, making outcomes more representative. And RCV would reduce the fundraising burden on candidates and reduce the role of money in politics. And we'll talk about how that works. But first, the first lose. So we said that the two-round runoff is a lose-lose situation. So we'll say the first lose is that Sacramento's current method, council members are usually elected in the primary election. And because primaries consistently and substantially have lower voter turnout than the general election, these outcomes are not as representative of the community as they could be. So when we say low voter turnout, here's an example of what we mean. This graph looks at the total number of ballots cast in last year's elections in the city of Sacramento. Deb showed an earlier graph that looked at the votes cast in the mayoral race. This looks at the total number of votes cast, just ballots cast overall in the city of Sacramento. And we'll see that the general election voter turnout was nearly twice as big as the primary election turnout. So the primary election turnout is very small, and we're seeing a very large turnout gap between the primary and the general. And that gap is actually typical of election cycles in Sacramento. So this graph looks at the last 5 election cycles, and the primary election voter turnout in each of those cycles is shown in the red bar, and the general election turnout is shown in the blue bar. And again, we see that the gap between the two is consistently substantial. So the general election consistently gets much higher voter turnout than the primary. It's also worth pointing out that when we look at those red bars, the primary voter turnout, it's not just that it's small, it's also that it's distinctly disproportionate to the community. So it's a poor representation demographically of the community on the basis of race, ethnicity, age, and wealth. Whereas the general election voter turnout is a closer representation of the community's demographics. And that's concerning because 3 out of every 4 races for city council in Sacramento are decided in the primary election. And so in this case, in 70% of cases, nobody goes on to run in the general election. 70% of the time, the primary picks them. So we think that this is a small and non-representative sampling of the voters in Sacramento who are picking the city council most of the time. And it's worth noting that there are tens of thousands of voters in Sacramento who vote in every fall election, but they don't vote very often in the primary. And so these are voters who consider themselves engaged. They're casting votes in presidential races, gubernatorial races, and races for the House and things like that. And they have never seen their council member's name on a ballot. So we think that that's a bad outcome from the perspective of voter engagement. So how would RCV solve this problem? Pretty simple. With RCV, we could just eliminate the primary election for local races and just allow all the candidates to run in the general election where more people vote and diverse voices can be heard. And with RCV, we could do this because RCV does not need 2 elections to identify a majority winner. So in this way, more voters would feel connected to their local process and feel heard in the local process. And, more people may even know who their city council member is. So we think that's a win. With RCV, substantially more voters are involved, feel connected, and have a voice in Sacramento's local elections. And that would be at no additional cost. So this benefits representativeness. Okay, but now we want to talk about the other lose, right? We said that the current election system in Sacramento is a lose-lose situation. So the other lose is when the 2 candidates do go to a runoff in the fall, in the general election. When candidates do go to a runoff, Sacramento's current method requires each candidate to run a whole second campaign. And this doubles a candidate's reliance on fundraising. So you might recall when we saw this pie chart finding that 70% of the time the race is decided in the low turnout primary. And you might think, yeah, that's pretty bad. But at least 30% of the time, the race goes to the general election with higher voter turnout. So that's a good thing, right? And unfortunately, that's a bad thing too, but in a different way. Because in a general election, we're essentially asking each of the top 2 vote getters to run a whole second campaign. So they have to fundraise all over again. The other thing that's worth noting, and Ismar pointed out, one of the problems with runoffs is they generally occur up to 6 weeks after the first election. Well, in Sacramento's case, this runoff typically occurs 6 to 8 months after the primary election. So it essentially is extending what was, let's say, a 3 to 6 month campaign up to the primary, by another 6 to 8 months to get to the general election. It's very expensive, and it tends to promote negative attack ads to get to the general election runoff in the fall. So when we say that it's expensive to run the second campaign, here's what we're talking about. So this chart looks at the average amount that a candidate for city council in Sacramento must raise to run their campaign. And this looks at the last 5 election cycles, so the same period of time that we've been looking at. And to make the runoff, if we look at that bar on the left, candidates on average are going to raise $136,000 and change. And maybe that's reasonable. But then if that candidate makes the runoff to compete in the general election, they're going to have to raise over $250,000 on average. And we would suggest that's a pretty excessive amount for a local city council race. And it's more likely that when a candidate has to raise $250,000, they're going to have to spend a lot more time courting high moneyed interests. And that's time that could be better spent listening to voters. This is because the candidate has been forced to essentially campaign. So running 2 campaigns means they're campaigning for about a year and a half, which is a very expensive proposition, as these graphs do show. So how would RCV solve this? Well, again, with RCV, we only need one election. So RCV reduces the fundraising burden by allowing the voters to elect a candidate in one election instead of 2. And this allows candidates to spend more time engaging voters. They wouldn't face the pressure to raise quite as much money, and this benefits representativeness. So altogether, RCV replaces Sacramento's lose-lose situation with a win-win solution. Of course, there are also the universal benefits of RCV that we don't want to forget about. And this is, Deb gave us some really great data on this, but just to recap it, RCV does promote voter choice and majority winners. There's no more vote splitting or strategic voting with RCV. RCV improves the tone of campaigns, encourages civility. RCV also improves representation for women and people of color, and it encourages broader voter engagement. So these are all benefits that, because they occur reliably in communities that do use RCV, we would expect these benefits to also occur in Sacramento if Sacramento starts using RCV. So how would we start to use RCV for Sacramento's local elections? We would just update the city charter. We're fortunate. A lot of cities in California don't have a city charter, but Sacramento has one. And that means that the voters can choose the rules of their elections. So this year, we'll ask our city council to put a measure on the ballot so that Sacramento voters can choose whether to start using RCV. Better Ballot Sacramento is a growing coalition that is making this request. These are some of the community organizations that are in our coalition right now. Better Ballot Sacramento was started and launched by the League of Women Voters of Sacramento County. And since that time, our coalition has attracted additional organizations that all want to support ranked choice voting for our local elections. Folks who are interested in this effort, or maybe you want to dig into the data that we've been showing, are encouraged to check out betterballotsacramento.org. That's our website. If you have questions, or if you want to volunteer to support this effort, please send us an email at info@betterballotsacramento.org. And of course, please do follow us on social media. We're on Facebook, Instagram, and Blue Sky. And if you're following us on social media, please look for our open letter to council and consider signing. Soon we're going to be launching an open letter to our city council that's going to be asking the council to consider putting this measure on the ballot. We're going to be distributing that sometime in the next 3 weeks. So we hope that you'll follow, if nothing else, so you could see that open letter and consider lending your voice of support to it. And that wraps up my presentation. And we already have some questions coming in the chat. So thank you, everybody, for giving us your questions. I'm just going to start jumping into these, and I welcome and encourage Ismar and Deb to jump in and help me out with some of these questions. So first is, let's see, do you have to rank all the candidates? I don't know if Deb or Ismar, if you want to.
No,
Yeah,
it's totally optional. Ballot instructions will tell you you can rank as many or as few as you want. Some voters go in and rank just one choice. Some voters use all of the choices. What we've found is most common is a lot of voters rank about half of the candidates. And so it's totally up to individual choice how much you want to rank.
Okay, thank you. Next question is, does adoption of RCV affect voter turnout? And I think, Deb, you kind of, that might have been before your presentation tackled that question, but I don't know if you have anything that you just want to add to it or elaborate.
Yeah, I think in Sacramento's case, by eliminating that primary, it would really help your we elect people at a low turnout time problem. It probably putting ranked choice voting in the general election is not really going to change your bottom line on turnout. Your turnout's probably driven by governor, senate, president, rather than Sacramento city elections. But it won't hurt, and it can help that primary problem.
Great, thank you. Next question. This is interesting. Would you rank a candidate that you don't like? I probably wouldn't.
If I had two candidates I didn't like, then I would rank them so I could make sure to put my least favorite last, right? Like if you've got two that you really want to put at the end, but if it came down to it, you probably do have a preference between those two, even if you really dislike both of them. So there might be a reason to, as a ranking nerd, I would rank everybody.
Yeah, I agree. The more people you rank, whether you like them or dislike them, the more your ballot contributes to the process, and the more of a voice you continue to have in this iterative process. So,
Yeah, the other thing that maybe I'll suggest, and Ismar, I think you really got to this too, about how RCV just produces more data and you can make more intelligent decisions with more data. Even if the candidate who wins is the candidate that you didn't want to win, your ranking says something because all of that becomes part of the votes cast record. And so the elected officials or whoever else, they can all see that and they can all know, like, oh, okay, candidate A is really unpopular, but candidate B was even less popular. If you decide to rank A above B, then you could contribute to that uh, identification.
right, and as Deb pointed out, most big majority of the people see one of their top two or three candidates elected. So this is just, you know, many fewer people are unsatisfied with the outcome when you have RCV. So like, oh, my first choice didn't win, but look, my second choice won. So Cambridge has been, for example, doing RCV for 70 years or something, and they have great stats on this. And something like 95% of people see one of the top three choices elected there. So Cantabrigians are very happy with this. They love it. And the reason I'm pointing out the 70 years is the more election cycles you do with RCV, the more used to it people are, the more prepared they are, the more they know what to look for. Candidates behave differently. So there may be some maybe issues in the beginning and maybe some glitches to resolve, but the more you use RCV, the mindset, the culture changes so that RCV really produces the most benefit that it can.
That's helpful. Thank you. And then the next question, are you including the County Board of Supervisors, District Attorney, and Sheriff in this change? That sounds like a question for a Better Ballot Sacramento. And the short answer is yes. We support RCV for the Sacramento County elections as well as the city. Now, our open letter to council is going to be simply addressing city council issues because our city council and our city voters will only have jurisdiction over city elections. But most of our effort right now is just raising awareness of how RCV works and the benefits of it. And so far, our effort has had a reach that goes beyond city limits and includes all of Sacramento County. So that's my circuitous way of saying yes and no. Um, Next question. Does Sacramento have the equipment to run an RCV election? Yes, Sacramento does already have the equipment. Sacramento has a Dominion election administration equipment, and that is compatible with RCV. In fact, it provides the ability to rank as many as 10 candidates. So we're set up and ready to go from that standpoint. It's likely that RCV would save the city significantly more money than it would cost the city. And it would save the city some money by removing the need to have local races on the primary ballot. Next question. Does this require a charter amendment, and when will it be on the ballot? Sounds like another Sacramento question. Yes, it would require a charter amendment. And when will it be on the ballot? Hopefully next year. We've started some conversations with our city council about the city council voting to put it on next year's ballot. We already have some strong support on the council, and we want to continue that dialogue. And in the meantime, just raising awareness of RCV. Even our strongest supporters on city council have told us, yeah, but you got to go out and raise awareness of this in the community so that if it's on the ballot, it'll pass. But that's the goal right now, is getting it on the 2026 ballot. And I think we have, I feel like I'm hogging the mic. I think we have one more question. Do more candidates run in this system in RCV? Do we see, I don't know if Deb or Ismar, if you have, do we see more candidates actually running?
We have seen that at the municipal level. Most specifically in the first election after ranked choice is introduced, you get all of these candidates who previously thought that maybe they didn't have a chance, and now they're willing to. They say, oh, this could be like a different style of campaigning, and voters can engage differently, and so people throw their hats in the ring. Then after that spike that you often see in the first year, you come back down to, yes, more candidates, but not a huge number more over the long term.
Oh, great. Okay, thank you. That's really helpful. And let's see. Here's the other, another question is, does RCV affect undervoting? So I'm not sure. Yeah, I guess, does RCV affect undervoting? I guess that question could be interpreted a few ways. I guess one is, yeah, go ahead, Deb. You could take a crack at it.
I think usually when people say undervoting, they mean voters who skipped that whole race. So like for municipal elections, voters who voted for president and for Senate, but then didn't vote for Sacramento offices. That would be an undervote when you skip the race. And research shows that ranked choice voting decreases those. So when you see a down ballot RCV race, people are more likely to participate in that. But that is municipal research only. It's not clear whether that's also true at the state level, but we're talking about municipal here, so good enough. Sometimes when people ask about undervoting in ranked choice, they mean like skipping some rankings, like ranking a first and second choice, but not a third. And that's not That's not typically what undervoting means, but of course that does happen in ranked choice. A lot of voters don't use all of the rankings, and that's just fine.
Got it. Thank you. And I'm just checking. Okay, we got a question just popped in. What are the arguments against RCV? Who opposes this? I don't know if folks want to take a crack at this. I can jump. I'll like the skepticism that I have heard of it in the conversations that we've had, and I'm sure Ismar and Dave have heard this. It's too complicated. We've heard critics or skeptics say that RCV is too complicated for the voter to understand. That's why I think advocating RCV now is so much easier than it would have been 20 years ago because we have so much data showing that it's not complicated. Voters get it right away. It's rather intuitive. But I don't know if Deb or Ismar, if you have anything to add to that.
I mean, there are. I'm actually immersed. I'm in the middle of this big project that's analyzing something like 4,000 RCV elections from the U.S., Scotland, and Australia for various sort of anomalous behaviors. And when I say that, my brain goes right to that. You might have heard of this Alaska special election 2020, which exhibited some slightly strange things that, like the politics latched onto immediately, but this is completely unjustified. That election, in fact, is an argument for RCV. And whatever objections people had with that election, the things that happen in an election are so rare and so really probabilistically, statistically insignificant. So a lot of the concern comes out of this, one or two kind of elections that seem kind of weird, where like the person who won the most first place votes initially, the plurality winner, doesn't actually win, because that can happen, right? Another candidate might overtake the plurality winner. So typically there's, a lot of press and a lot of politics around this when this happens. It happened in Burlington, Vermont, it happened in Alaska. But there really are in the US, 2 out of 400 elections where something like this, maybe I wouldn't, as a mathematician, I don't call it strange. It's just math of RCV elections. But so the opponents of RCV will kind of like pluck these examples, and sort of showcase them and pretend they're bigger than they are. But if you're election nerd, then you might say, what about like Condorcet things and Borda things and all that? No, RCV is best out of all those other things you might use. It really picks the Condorcet winner all the time, pretty much. And it prevents the spoiler, and they're all the good mathematical features that it has that really are really there. So yeah, some people advocate for other types of voting methods, but they have much bigger flaws than RCV does. I don't want to sort of get too much into it, but yeah.
Yeah, and I mean, to the concern that some folks will say, well, it's too confusing or RCV is too complicated. I know that, and Fairvote publishes a lot of this data, a lot of survey data, a lot of exit polling that shows that voters understand it very well. They seem to understand it at least as well or better than voters understand Sacramento's current system. And all that data is really great. But the thing that I like to go back to and cite is a fun thing. I'll plug Better Ballot Sacramento's event programming that we do. Last summer, we held our own RCV election to elect the most popular beer of a beloved local brewery, New Helvetia. And we just asked random customers to rank the beers. And they did. We had these little ballots, and then we counted the ballots in front of everybody. And it was a fun event. And I feel that everyone had a good time, and they felt that a popular beer won. If it wasn't their top choice, it was probably their second or third, and so they were relatively happy. But that was, in a noisy beer hall on a Friday night. I had to stand up on a stool and explain it to folks, and they nodded heads and they got it and they did it. So I'm pretty confident that voters will understand RCV pretty well.
That's great. Actually,
Uh,
my book, thank you both for plugging my book, by the way. But in my book, I do an example with Portland breweries in Portland, Maine. So I'm right. I'm on the same page with the beer being a good example for this.
uh, let's see, we've got one more question. Does this conflict with one person, one vote?
No, easy answer. This has come up in a handful. This has come up a handful of times. Every court that has examined this issue has upheld RCV against the one person, one vote claim. Your vote, you're getting one vote, and it only counts for one candidate. If your candidate is eliminated, your one vote goes on and counts for your second choice. It's not a second vote. Your vote will never count twice. There's no points, there's no partial values. You have one vote, and it's counting for your highest ranked candidate. And so, yes, federal courts and state courts have upheld RCV against the one person, one vote question.
The way I like, yeah, that's all. I completely agree with all that. The way I think about it is like one vote in RC. One vote means one ranking, and you let the process do its thing with the entire ranking. So yeah, people conflate the two, and it's not. It's a different system. So what one vote means, it means different things in these two systems.
Okay, and now the questions are rolling in. We probably have time for maybe two or three more. But I'll say one more thing about that question of does RCV conflict with one person, one vote? And the way I've kind of looked at it is like if we could construe RCV as conflicting with one person, one vote, we could construe the two-round runoff as conflicting with it because you vote once in the primary and then you vote again in the general election, and you might even vote for the same candidate twice. So, I mean, I would say that the two-round runoff is legitimate, then RCV certainly is. Um, but one of the questions that just popped in: how do candidates feel about RCV?
It's kind of a mixed bag. There are a number of candidates who have run and said, this was the best experience. I'm so glad we have this. And there are also candidates who have run and said, oh, I didn't like this. My opponents tried to team up against me. And so just like anything, it's going to have people who like it and people who don't. Candidates who do well under RCV tend to be the ones who can reach beyond just one base. So like consensus builders who are willing to talk to different types of voters, address multiple issues rather than just their one niche issue. On the other hand, candidates who struggle are those who are polarizing and kind of unwilling to engage with voters beyond their own base. And so I think that kind of tells you what you need to know about who ends up liking it and who ends up coming out against it.
Okay, great. And actually, we have just one more question. What, if anything, would the county of Sacramento have to do for the city of Sacramento to use RCV in our elections? Um, Nothing. They already have the Dominion equipment that can administer an RCV election. The county would um, stop administering primary elections for our city council races. So it wouldn't be anything that they would have to do. There'd be fewer things that they would have to do if we started using RCV. Um, and that's it for the questions. I'll just put another call out for folks that one of the things that Better Ballot Sacramento does to raise awareness of RCV is we will give presentations and hold Q&As and do workshops with any community local group that's interested in doing that. So we're talking neighborhood associations, civic leagues, political clubs, social clubs, you name it. So if your group has any interest, we'll give a presentation, we'll answer questions in whatever format. We do them in person, or we do them over Zoom, whatever works for you. So we do want to make ourselves available. And I think that's my last wrap up. Yeah, any final thoughts, Deb or Ismar, before we close it out?
Well, we're just really excited at Fair Vote when local campaigns get going to address city specific issues. So we are really excited to see the energy around this in Sacramento. Congrats to the Better Ballot Sacramento team for getting it this far, and we are with you and cheering you on, and very excited to see this keep moving forward.
And I'll just add the same effort is happening in Boston right now, right next door. So there's another big city where things are looking good. In my little town suburb of Boston, my son, who is 17 years old and he's a senior in high school, is running a ranked choice voting campaign here with a few of his high school friends out of the politics club that we have in town here. And the town council is listening. So this is a serious thing. There's clearly a need for this kind of reform. 70% of Americans are dissatisfied with democracy. This has nothing to do with this election, whether a candidate won or didn't in this election. There's a long brewing dissatisfaction with democracy, and part of it is attributable to the failing mechanisms. What's under the hood, again, the math that runs democracy is no longer really serving us. Some of it is 250 years old, has not been revisited or questioned or scrutinized in centuries, and it is no longer producing outcomes that we as Americans find valuable. And one of the ways to remedy this is revisit those mechanisms and implement better ones. And RCV is one of those things. And there are lots of others, but it is one critical thing, I think.
Deb and Ismar, you've been incredible. Thank you so much, especially at this late hour. You're on the East Coast, so we appreciate your staying up to be on this panel with our little West Coast town. So thank you for that. And thank you to all of our participants. In particular, thank you for the great questions. We hope you'll stay tuned.
Thank you.
All right. Have a good night, everyone.